September 1945. A former military school on the outskirts of Tokyo, now stripped of its flags. The morning air is still. Tatami mats line a long wooden hall. Boots echo where sandals once moved in silence. A group of Japanese women stand in orderly rows. They wear simple uniforms, now no insignia, no rank markings. Weeks ago, they were officers, communications specialists, medical supervisors, logistics coordinators for an empire that no longer exists. Outside, American military police wait with clipboards. Young men, dusty uniforms. The war already feels far away to them. An interpreter steps forward. His voice is careful. The question is brief, unexpected, almost casual. They are told they may choose what happens next: repatriation, civilian life, continued service in support roles. No orders will be given. For a moment, no one moves. These women were trained to receive commands, not possibilities. To obey, not decide. Honor had always flowed downward from emperor to officer to subordinate. Now, the chain is gone. Eyes lower, hands tighten. Some breathe faster. Others go perfectly still. Because for them, this is not freedom being offered. It is abandonment. And in that silence, heavy, disciplined, terrified, the true weight of defeat finally settles in, revealing a deeper question that reaches far beyond this room, into the very structure of wartime Japan itself. To understand why that single question caused such visible shock, it is necessary to return to the world that shaped these women long before the war ended. Imperial Japan did not collapse in September 1945. It imploded. For decades, Japanese society had been built on a vertical structure of obedience. Authority flowed downward. Responsibility flowed upward. Individual choice, especially in matters of duty, was neither encouraged nor admired. It was often viewed as dangerous. This worldview did not originate with the Second World War. It was inherited from centuries of Confucian hierarchy, reinforced by the Meiji Restoration and hardened by modern militarism. By the 1930s, the Japanese state had fused nationalism, emperor worship, and military discipline into a single moral system. Loyalty was not a preference. It was an obligation. Within the system, the emperor was not simply a political leader. He was sacred. Orders issued in his name carried moral weight beyond legality. To obey was virtuous. To question was shameful. To choose independently, especially during wartime, bordered on moral failure. Women occupied a carefully defined place inside this structure. They were not frontline combat soldiers, but they were not detached from the war either. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, Japan faced severe manpower shortages. As the conflict expanded across China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific, the state increasingly mobilized women into military-adjacent roles. Japanese women served as army nurses, communications officers, clerks, transport coordinators, intelligence assistants, and factory supervisors supporting military production. Many were formally commissioned within auxiliary structures. They wore uniforms. They followed regulations. They operated under military law. Yet their authority was strictly conditional. They could issue instructions, but only within narrowly defined roles. They could manage resources, but not determine outcomes. They could enforce discipline, but never policy. Most importantly, they did not decide their own futures. Training emphasized endurance, silence, and emotional restraint. Personal desire was framed as selfishness. Survival itself was conditional upon usefulness. If capture occurred, doctrine was brutally clear. Surrender was dishonor. Capture was shame. Death was preferable. This ideology was not theoretical. It was reinforced daily through instruction manuals, speeches, and ritual. Women in military service were taught that their duty did not end with defeat. If necessary, they were to destroy documents, assist wounded male soldiers, and accept death without resistance. As the war turned decisively against Japan after 1943, these expectations intensified. Allied bombing raids devastated cities. Supply lines collapsed. Food shortages spread. Still, the official message never changed. Endurance would bring salvation. Obedience would preserve honor. Then, in August 1945, everything stopped. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki shattered any remaining illusion of control. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation by radio. It was the first time most Japanese citizens had ever heard his voice. He spoke of endurance. He spoke of the unbearable. He did not speak of victory. For millions, the broadcast was incomprehensible not only linguistically, but psychologically. The emperor had not issued a command to fight. He had not ordered death. He had ordered surrender. For Japanese military personnel, including women officers, this created a void. Orders ceased. Chains of command disintegrated overnight. Units disbanded without instructions. Officers were left responsible for subordinates but answerable to no higher authority. In that vacuum, fear replaced doctrine. Many women officers destroyed records and equipment, not knowing what allied occupation would bring. Some prepared for punishment, others prepared for death. Very few prepared for personal choice, because in the world they had been trained for, fate was decided above them, not by them. That is the psychological landscape these women carried with them into occupation-controlled compounds where an entirely different philosophy was waiting, one that would collide with everything they had been taught to believe. While Japanese military personnel struggled to understand a world without orders, the forces occupying that world were guided by an entirely different set of assumptions. The American occupation of Japan was not designed as a continuation of war by other means. Officially, it was framed as a transformation. General Douglas MacArthur, appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, arrived with a mandate that combined control with reconstruction. The goal was not merely to disarm Japan, but to remake it. American military doctrine carried its own ideological weight. U.S. soldiers were trained to value initiative, individual judgment, and personal responsibility. Even within rigid hierarchies, the concept of choice was central. A soldier followed orders, but he was also expected to think, adapt, and decide when circumstances demanded it. This mindset shaped occupation policy from the very beginning. Enemy soldiers were disarmed, but many were not imprisoned. Officers were questioned, processed, and often released. Women auxiliaries, in particular, occupied a gray zone. They were not considered combatants in the Western sense. Many had no direct involvement in battlefield violence. American planners classified them as support personnel, useful, educated, and potentially cooperative. At ground level, however, policy was inconsistent. Young American soldiers and military police were suddenly responsible for managing people. They had been trained to fight, not administer. Language barriers complicated everything. Cultural knowledge was minimal. Many Americans assumed that the Japanese, having surrendered, would simply welcome direction. Instead, they encountered silence. Occupation manuals emphasized humane treatment. Coercion was discouraged. The war was over, and the new objective was stability. This led to a critical operational assumption that former enemy personnel should be allowed, wherever possible, to reintegrate voluntarily into civilian life. For American officers, asking individuals what they wanted to do next seemed practical, almost generous. Repatriation or release reduced logistical burdens. Voluntary cooperation eased tensions. Choice appeared efficient. What was not understood was how alien the concept was to those on the receiving end. In Japanese military culture, asking a subordinate to decide their own fate was not empowerment, it was abdication. Authority existed to absorb responsibility. To remove it without replacement was destabilizing. It forced individuals to shoulder moral and social consequences they had never been trained to bear. For women officers, this effect was magnified. They existed at the intersection of two rigid systems. One defined them as obedient servants of the state. The other now viewed them as individuals capable of autonomous decision-making. Neither system had prepared them for the transition between the two. American interpreters often softened the language of occupation directives, believing clarity would reduce fear. In reality, the lack of explicit instruction created anxiety. When told there would be no punishment, many did not feel relief. They felt suspicion. When told they could choose, they felt exposed. Choice implied accountability. Accountability implied blame. Some feared choosing wrongly would dishonor their families. Others feared that choosing at all was a betrayal of comrades who had died without the luxury of decision. A few believed that accepting civilian life was equivalent to admitting moral failure. From the American perspective, the silence was baffling. They saw educated women, disciplined and capable, frozen by indecision. They mistook shock for defiance, restraint for resistance. In reality, they were witnessing something far more fragile. A moment when an entire worldview collapses, and nothing has yet replaced it. This gap in understanding would shape countless interactions during the early occupation period. It would influence how former officers were processed, how policies were adjusted, and how American commanders slowly realized that victory did not automatically translate into comprehension, and it set the stage for the deeply personal conflicts that unfolded next. Conflicts that cannot be explained by strategy or policy alone, but only by examining the human angles of this moment, one by one. For the women standing in those halls and courtyards, the war did not end with surrender. It ended with uncertainty. Many had entered military service in their late teens or early 20s. Some were recruited directly from schools. Others volunteered under intense social pressure, encouraged by teachers, families, and local officials. Military service was framed not as a career choice, but as a moral obligation. To refuse was to shame one's household. Over years of service, personal identity narrowed. Names gave way to ranks. Individual ambition dissolved into routine. Even emotions were regulated. Fear was suppressed. Grief was private. Doubt was dangerous. When American soldiers asked them to decide their own fate, the request landed not as freedom, but as disorientation. Without orders, there was no correct response. Without a superior's instruction, there was no protection from error. Some women later described the moment as physically destabilizing. Hands shook. Vision narrowed. A few reported nausea or dizziness. These were not signs of weakness. They were symptoms of psychological collapse following prolonged ideological conditioning. Choice required an internal compass they had never been encouraged to develop. The weight of family expectation pressed heavily. Returning home meant facing neighbors who had lost sons and husbands. Survival itself could provoke suspicion. Why were you alive when others were not? What had you done to deserve it? For others, remaining with occupation authorities felt equally impossible. Continued service suggested collaboration. Cooperation with the enemy had no clear moral framework in their training. There was only loyalty, and the object of that loyalty was gone. In that moment, silence became the safest response, not defiance, not resistance. Self-preservation. Japanese wartime culture did not view fate as flexible. It was inherited, accepted, and endured. The concept of giri duty bound by social obligation governed behavior more powerfully than law. Decisions were evaluated not by personal outcome, but by collective impact. A correct action was one that preserved harmony, even at great personal cost. Being asked to choose violated this principle. Choice isolated the individual from the group. It forced personal accountability in a system designed to distribute responsibility across hierarchy. In practical terms, this meant that whatever decision a woman made could not be justified by orders. It would belong to her alone. In Japanese moral logic, that was dangerous. Western interpretations of freedom assumed choice reduced suffering. In this cultural context, choice increased it. It invited judgment. It created space for regret. It risked dishonor without the shield of obedience. The women officers were not confused by the words spoken. They were destabilized by the implication. That destabilization would only deepen as they realized the Americans genuinely expected an answer. For the American personnel present, the scene was profoundly puzzling. Many were barely out of adolescence themselves. They had fought across islands, endured bombardment, lost friends. Now they were expected to oversee peace. Their training had not included anthropology. Their briefings offered statistics, not psychology. To them, the women appeared disciplined, capable, and educated. Asking them to decide their future seemed respectful, humane, even progressive. The silence was misread. Some soldiers assumed the women were waiting for permission to speak. Others suspected passive resistance. A few grew impatient, interpreting the lack of response as stubbornness or manipulation. What they did not recognize was that their question had removed the last remaining structure holding these women upright, and that misunderstanding would lead directly into the most critical moment of the encounter, when silence was no longer an option, and something had to give. In the Japanese military system, command was not merely functional. It was moral. Orders carried ethical weight because they transferred responsibility upward. If an action resulted in failure or death, the burden belonged to the commander, not the subordinate. This structure allowed individuals to endure extreme hardship without internal conflict. They were instruments of a higher will. By September 1945, that structure had disintegrated. Many senior officers were dead. Others were imprisoned. Some had committed suicide in the days following surrender. Communications networks were shattered. Written orders ceased entirely. What remained were fragments of authority without legitimacy for women officers. This collapse was absolute. They were trained to manage systems, not to replace them. Their rank existed within a male-dominated hierarchy that had now vanished. No superior remained to authorize their decisions. No institutional framework existed to validate their actions. When American officials asked them to choose, they were effectively being asked to assume a level of authority they had never been permitted to hold, not just over logistics or personnel, but over their own moral destiny. That leap was not simply difficult, it was unthinkable. Without command, action felt illegitimate. Without legitimacy, action felt shameful. The safest position was paralysis. Despite their uniforms, these women were never intended to become autonomous actors. Imperial Japan mobilized women as extensions of the male war effort. Their service was praised as self-sacrifice, not leadership. Propaganda celebrated their endurance, modesty, and obedience, not initiative or decision-making. Even within the military, their authority was constrained. They could supervise, but not strategize. They could enforce rules, but not alter them. Their value lay in execution, not judgment. The sudden expectation of autonomy clashed violently with this reality. American occupation forces, influenced by their own social norms, often underestimated how radical the shift was. To them, asking a woman to choose her future was normal. To these women, it was unprecedented. Gender amplified the burden of choice. Women were expected to preserve family honor, not redefine it. A wrong decision risked social exile, economic hardship, or lifelong stigma. There was no clear path that promised dignity. What appeared, on the surface, as an offer of agency was experienced as exposure. At its core, the encounter raised an uncomfortable question. Is choice always humane? In wartime, morality is imposed. In defeat, morality fractures. The occupying power believed it was offering compassion by removing coercion. Yet compassion without understanding can feel like abandonment. The women were not asking for freedom. They were asking for direction. By refusing to issue orders, the Americans believed they were respecting human dignity. But dignity, in this context, had been defined differently for generations. It had been rooted in obedience, not autonomy. This moral disconnect did not produce violence or rebellion. It produced silence. And in that silence, the moment reached its breaking point when the Americans realized something had gone wrong. And the women realized that no answer might be worse than any answer at all. That realization marked the beginning of the true turning point. The breaking point did not arrive with shouting or confrontation. It arrived quietly. Inside the processing hall, the interpreter repeated the question, slower this time, more carefully. The women remained still. Minutes passed. The Americans exchanged glances. Clipboards lowered. A senior officer stepped closer, his posture relaxed but his voice firm. He clarified that no punishment would follow. No rests. No reprisals. The war was over. Still nothing. For the Japanese women, the repetition made the situation worse. In their experience, a repeated question meant a wrong answer had already been given by silence. Anxiety tightened across the room. Some stared at the floor. Others fixed their gaze on the interpreter, searching his face for guidance that was not coming. Then one woman shifted her weight. She was older than the others. Her uniform was worn thin at the cuffs. She had served longer, seen more collapse than most. Slowly, she stepped forward, not confidently, but deliberately. She did not answer the question. Instead, she asked one of her own, who would take responsibility for the consequences. The interpreter hesitated. He looked to the American officer. The officer paused, confused by the phrasing. Responsibility, to him, was obvious. Each person owned their decision. That answer was translated. The woman nodded once and stepped back into line. The meaning was unmistakable. Without responsibility flowing downward from authority, there could be no decision. At that moment, the Americans began to understand that their framework had failed. The silence was no longer passive. It was communicative. Orders were expected. Direction was necessary. And by refusing to provide it, the occupying force had unintentionally recreated the very chaos they sought to avoid. The turning point came not from policy, but from realization. Something fundamental had been misjudged. Once the misunderstanding became visible, the atmosphere in the hall shifted. American officers withdrew to confer. The decision to offer unrestricted choice, made with efficiency in mind, was now clearly destabilizing the very people it was meant to process. What had seemed humane on paper had become paralyzing in practice. When they returned, the language changed. Instead of asking what the women wished to do, the interpreter explained what would happen next. Temporary accommodation would be provided. Food rations would be issued. Medical evaluations would follow. At a later date, options for civilian reintegration would be presented with guidance. The relief was immediate and unmistakable. Shoulders loosened. Breathing slowed. Several women bowed not deeply, but reflexively. Structure had returned. Not command in the old imperial sense, but sequence, procedure, predictability. No one had chosen anything yet, but the burden of deciding had been postponed. This moment marked a subtle but critical shift in occupation practice. American personnel began to recognize that the absence of coercion did not automatically produce cooperation. In some cases, it produced collapse. Guidance was not oppression. For people emerging from rigid hierarchies, it was stabilization. For the women officers, this was not a return to obedience. It was a bridge. Over the following days, interviews were conducted individually, not collectively. Questions were framed differently. Instead of "What do you want to do?" they were asked, "Here are the next steps. Are you able to follow them?" The difference was profound. Gradually, some women accepted civilian repatriation. Others remained temporarily in support roles, assisting occupation authorities with translation, administration, or medical services. A few requested transfers to relief work, caring for displaced civilians. None of these outcomes were dramatic. That is precisely why they mattered. The climax of this story was not a battle or an explosion. It was a moment of psychological recalibration when the victorious assumptions collided, and one quietly gave way. Yet the consequences of that moment did not end in the processing hall. They followed these women into the months and years that came next, shaping their lives long after uniforms were folded away. The days following that encounter unfolded without ceremony, but they carried lasting weight. Japanese women officers were gradually separated from formal military status. Uniforms were collected or altered. Rank ceased to exist. Identification papers replaced service records. The transition was administrative, almost clinical, yet psychologically severe for many. The loss of uniform was more unsettling than the loss of authority. It had provided identity, protection, and explanation. Without it, they returned to society not as veterans, but as women with unexplained absences and complicated past. Repatriation was uneven. Some women returned to intact family homes. Others found neighborhoods flattened by bombing, relatives dead or displaced, livelihoods erased. In these environments, former military service could be both a liability and a necessity. Skills learned under wartime discipline, organization, medical care, communication became survival tools, yet silence followed them. Public discussion of women's military roles remained limited in early post-war Japan. The narrative of defeat focused on male soldiers, prisoners of war, and national suffering. Women who had served were often expected to disappear quietly back into civilian roles, carrying their experiences without acknowledgement. Psychologically, the aftermath was complex. Some women described a delayed collapse months after repatriation. Without daily structure, insomnia and anxiety emerged. Others struggled with guilt both for surviving and for adapting. A few expressed relief that they were no longer bound by imperial doctrine, though that relief was often accompanied by disorientation. American occupation authorities documented these transitions in reports and memos, noting compliance but rarely comprehension. The emotional consequences were not their primary concern. Stability was. Still, the encounter left traces. Interpreters reported adjustments in phrasing. Processing protocols evolved. Choice was reintroduced gradually, framed within guidance rather than absence of direction. The occupation had learned something but only partially. The deeper consequences would take longer to surface, revealing themselves not in policy documents, but in the long arc of social change that followed. As the occupation of Japan progressed, the quiet lessons of those early encounters began to ripple outward. American administrators increasingly recognized that dismantling a militarized society required more than removing weapons and issuing new laws. It required understanding how deeply authority had been woven into personal identity. For women who had served as officers, that realization came too late to ease the initial shock, but it shaped what followed. Educational reforms opened new pathways. Women gained legal rights that had been unimaginable only months earlier. Voting, property ownership, and access to higher education expanded rapidly under occupation policies. On paper, autonomy arrived suddenly. In practice, it arrived unevenly. Former women officers often occupied an ambiguous space. They were disciplined, capable, and accustomed to responsibility, yet conditioned to suppress personal ambition. Some adapted quickly, finding roles in nursing, administration, or teaching. Others withdrew, unable to reconcile new expectations with internalized restraint. What united them was the absence of recognition. Unlike male veterans, their service was rarely commemorated. There were no parades, no medals. Their contribution did not fit the post-war narrative of Reconstruction, which emphasized peace and domestic renewal. Acknowledging women's military roles complicated that story. In historical records, their presence appears in fragments, personnel lists, occupation interviews, medical reports, rarely in memoirs, rarely in public memory. The American soldiers who had asked that original question moved on. Many rotated home within months. For them, it was a brief administrative puzzle in a long war's aftermath. For the women, it was a defining moment. It was the first time the world demanded that they exist as individuals rather than instruments, not through force, but through expectation. The shock of that demand lingered long after the uniforms were gone. Over time, Japan would become a society where choice was normalized, even celebrated. But that transformation was not born fully formed. It emerged through moments like this, quiet, uncomfortable, and deeply human. Moments where freedom arrived not as triumph, but as uncertainty. And it is in that uncertainty that the final meaning of this encounter becomes clear. history often remembers wars through their violence, the battles, the explosions, the moments where nations collide. But the true turning points are sometimes quieter. In a wooden hall in occupied Japan, no shots were fired, no flags were raised or lowered. Yet a question simple, well-intended, and profoundly misunderstood exposed the deepest fracture left by the war. The women who stood in silence were not refusing freedom. They were encountering it without preparation. For them, choice was not liberation. It was responsibility without shelter. A demand to stand alone after a lifetime of being told that standing alone was dishonorable. The American soldiers believed they were offering dignity. In their world, dignity meant autonomy. In the world these women came from, dignity had meant endurance under command. Neither side was wrong, but neither side fully understood the other. That moment reveals something enduring about the aftermath of conflict. Victory does not instantly translate into moral clarity. Liberation does not arrive in a single shape. And freedom, when imposed without context, can feel as heavy as captivity. These women did not reshape history with speeches or resistance. They did so by surviving a transition no one had prepared them for, by absorbing the shock of a world that suddenly demanded individuality instead of obedience. Their silence was not emptiness. It was history adjusting itself. And in that adjustment, we are reminded that the end of war is not marked by surrender alone but by the long, uncertain process of learning how to live afterward.